He ran toward the flames just before the car could explode. The smoke was a thick, choking cloud, the smell of burning gasoline mixing with the tortured groan of twisted metal. Daniel, a single father who worked as a mechanic, wrenched the car door open, his shoulder searing with an intense, biting pain as he pulled the young woman out. She was unconscious, a trickle of blood running from her temple down the pristine collar of her white blouse. As he moved her, a silver locket slipped from beneath her collar, catching the firelight for a brief moment. It was engraved with the initials MM. He laid her gently on the grass, immediately starting chest compressions. Just as the vehicle erupted behind them in a deafening blast of fire and shrapnel, a wave of heat washing over his back, he felt a faint pulse beneath his fingers. The orange glow illuminated his face. A mask of sheer terror and profound relief. A police car screeched to a halt, but as one of the officers leaned down to check on the woman, his eyes widened in disbelief. He froze, whispering to his partner, "It can't be. That's his daughter." A power imbalance was instantly formed. Daniel, the anonymous savior, had just rescued the daughter of the very man who had cost him everything. He didn't know it yet, but inside the woman's discarded handbag, a corporate ID card read, "Marina Miles, R&D Division, Miles Automotive." It was the same corporation whose faulty engineering had led to the factory fire that had stolen his wife from him 4 years ago. The world returned in a cacophony of sirens. Red and blue lights pulsed across the dark asphalt, painting the surrounding woods in frantic, silent flashes of color. Daniel knelt on the cool grass, the heat from the burning car still a palpable presence at his back, his hands trembling slightly from the adrenaline. He had been pushed aside gently but firmly by a team of paramedics who now worked with practiced efficiency over the young woman. They spoke in low, urgent tones, a language of medical acronyms and vital signs he didn't understand. He watched, feeling strangely disconnected, as they fitted an oxygen mask over her face, secured a brace around her neck, and carefully lifted her onto a stretcher. For a moment, her face was illuminated by a paramedic's flashlight, and he saw the peaceful, almost surreal stillness of her features amidst the surrounding chaos. He felt a profound sense of relief mixed with a deep, unsettling ache. He had saved her, but the ghost of another fire, another loss, clawed at the edges of his memory. A police officer approached him, a man with a tired face and a notepad in his hand. "Sir, you're the one who pulled her out?" Daniel simply nodded, the throbbing in his shoulder now a dull, persistent burn. "Can you tell me what you saw?" He recounted the events in a flat, detached voice. The sudden swerve of the headlights in his rearview mirror, the horrifying screech of tires failing to find purchase, the sickening crunch of metal against the guardrail, and then the first flicker of orange that had bloomed into an inferno. He left out the part about his heart seizing in his chest, the visceral memory of his wife, Sarah, that had propelled him from his truck without a second thought. The officer jotted down notes, his expression impassive. "Looks like she lost control on the curve. We see it all the time on this stretch of road. You did a brave thing, son. Most people wouldn't have." The officer's words, meant to be a comfort, only reinforced the grim randomness of it all. It was just an accident, a terrible, tragic accident. As the ambulance doors closed and it pulled away, its sirens wailing into the night, Daniel felt a sudden urge to leave. He wanted nothing more than to go home to his daughter, Lily, to assure himself of her safety. But as he turned to go, his eyes caught a glint in the grass where the young woman had lain. It was the small, silver locket, its delicate chain snapped. He picked it up, its metallic surface cool against his skin. The engraved MM seemed to shimmer in the flashing lights. Nearby, her handbag lay open, its contents spilled across the damp earth. Acting on pure instinct, he began gathering her things: a leather wallet, a set of keys, a tube of lipstick. Tucked inside a side pocket of the bag, he found a laminated ID card. The photo was of the same woman, smiling faintly. The name read Marina Miles, and below it, R&D Division, Miles Automotive. The company name meant little to him in that moment. It was just one of several large corporations in the state. He slipped the ID and the locket into the pocket of his jacket, making a mental note to drop them off at the hospital the next day. They were her property, and he was just a man trying to do the right thing. The drive home was a blur. The familiar rumble of his old Ford pickup was a grounding presence in the deafening silence that now filled his head. He parked in the gravel driveway of his small, single-story house, the one he and Sarah had bought together, with dreams of filling it with laughter. Now, most nights, it was just quiet. He turned the key in the lock as gently as he could and stepped inside, the scent of stale coffee and motor oil greeting him like an old friend. He walked straight to his daughter's room. Lily was asleep, her small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm, her favorite stuffed bear clutched tightly in her arms. He stood there for a long time, watching her, the fierce, protective love of a father washing over him. It was in these quiet moments that Sarah's absence was most acute. He saw her in the gentle curve of Lily's cheek, in the stubborn way she slept. The fire on the highway had torn open a wound he thought had begun to scar over, reminding him of the fragility of it all, of how quickly a life could be extinguished. Later, sitting in his worn leather armchair in the living room, he absently turned on the television. The local news was on, and a reporter was standing in front of the still smoldering wreckage on the highway. "A hero who disappeared into the night," the reporter was saying, her voice filled with manufactured gravity. "Authorities are still searching for the anonymous Good Samaritan who pulled the lone occupant from the vehicle moments before it was engulfed in flames." Daniel switched the set-off with a tired sigh. He wasn't a hero. He was a mechanic, a father, a widower who knew the brutal cost of fire and circumstance. He pulled the items from his pocket and placed them on the wooden end table beside his chair. The silver locket, with its mysterious initials, lay beside the ID card bearing the name of a stranger and her employer. They were just pieces of a life he had briefly, violently intersected. He had no idea that these two small objects were not the end of his involvement, but the beginning of a journey back into the heart of the very fire that had defined his life. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The house was quiet, filled with the familiar aroma of coffee and toast. Daniel sat at the small wooden table, a half-empty mug warming his hands, the events of the previous night feeling like a fever dream. The pain in his shoulder was a constant, physical reminder that it had all been real. Across from him, his 7-year-old daughter Lily meticulously arranged her cereal into a perfect circle before eating it. Her presence was a comforting anchor, a testament to the life he had fought so hard to preserve after Sarah was gone. He watched her for a moment, the intensity of his love a fierce, protective barrier against the darkness of the world. He had a duty to that girl in the hospital, not just as a fellow human being, but as a father who understood the terrifying fragility of life. He had to return her things. It was the only piece of this chaotic puzzle that felt simple and right. The hospital was a world of hushed tones and sterile smells, a place that felt both foreign and painfully familiar to him. He walked its polished linoleum corridors, feeling out of place in his worn work boots and flannel shirt. After a brief stop at the nurse's station, he found the room number. He hesitated at the door, the silver locket and the ID card feeling heavy in his pocket. Taking a deep breath, he knocked softly and entered. The young woman from the wreck, Marina, was sitting up in bed, a bandage wrapped around her head. She looked pale and small in the stark white sheets, her eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and fear. She didn't recognize him at all. A doctor had already explained her condition to him, temporary amnesia due to severe head trauma. She knew she was in a hospital. She knew she had been in an accident, but the rest was a terrifying blank. "My name is Daniel," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "I was there last night. I found some of your things at the scene." He approached the bed slowly, as if not to startle a wild animal. Her eyes followed his every move. He pulled the items from his pocket and held them out. She looked first at the locket, turning it over in her slender fingers. The engraving elicited no response, just a vacant stare. But when he handed her the ID card, a visible change came over her. She read her own name, Marina Miles, and her brow furrowed slightly. Then her eyes landed on the corporate logo below it, Miles Automotive. A tremor ran through her hand. Her breathing hitched, and a primal, unmistakable fear clouded her features. She looked up at him, her voice a barely audible whisper. "Miles? Is that me?" Daniel saw it clearly. It wasn't the confusion of someone trying to remember, but the raw terror of someone trying to forget. He leaned forward slightly. "Are you all right? Does that name mean something to you?" She flinched, pulling back and shaking her head too quickly. "No, nothing. It's just... my head hurts," she stammered, placing the card face down on the bedside table as if it were something venomous. As she raised her hand to her temple, the sleeve of her hospital gown slid down her arm, revealing a peculiar scar on the inside of her wrist. It was old and faded, a pale, silvery mark against her skin, but its shape was distinct and unnatural. It looked less like the result of an accident and more like something that had been deliberately branded there. A perfect, stylized letter R. The detail was incongruous, another piece that didn't fit. He saw a frightened young woman with a mysterious past, not just the victim of a random car crash. His simple errand to return her belongings had suddenly become much more complicated. He left the hospital with a profound sense of unease. The official story, a straightforward accident on a dangerous curve, no longer sat right with him. The woman's visceral reaction to her own name and the strange branded scar on her wrist played over and over in his mind. He drove not home, but to his garage, the one sanctuary where the world made sense, where broken things could be understood and fixed. He stood in the middle of the concrete floor, surrounded by the familiar scent of oil and steel, tools hanging in their designated places on the wall. He picked up a heavy wrench, its weight familiar in his hand, but his mind was miles away, back in that sterile hospital room. It was then, standing in the quiet of his own space, that the two disparate pieces of his life violently collided. The name on the ID card, Miles Automotive. The fog of shock and exhaustion finally lifted, and he remembered with sickening clarity. It was the same company, the same corporation whose faulty components and subsequent cover-up had led to the industrial fire 4 years ago. The fire that had taken Sarah from him. The chilling possibility began to form, cold and sharp in his gut. What if the fire on the highway last night wasn't an accident at all? The days that followed were a blur of grease-stained hands and a mind consumed by suspicion. Daniel went through the motions of his life, fixing transmissions, packing Lily's lunch, reading her bedtime stories. But a part of him was detached, caught in a cold, internal loop of questions. The name Miles Automotive was no longer just a corporate logo. It was a ghost that haunted his garage, a phantom presence that whispered from the engine of every car he worked on. He had tried to bury the past, to build a new life for his daughter on the scorched earth of his grief. He had locked away the boxes of legal documents and faded newspaper clippings about the factory fire, believing that closure was a destination he could reach. Now, he understood that the past was not a place you could leave behind. It was a current, silent and deep, that had finally dragged him back under. One night, unable to sleep, he unlocked the storage closet and pulled out a dusty box labeled Sarah. He spent hours under the dim light of a single desk lamp, his wife's clear-eyed, smiling face looking up at him from old photographs as he unsealed the records of her death. He was in his small, cluttered office at the back of the garage 2 days later when the email arrived. It was from an anonymous server, the sender identified only by a single cryptic initial, M. The subject line was stark and chilling. "The fire you saw wasn't the first." His heart hammered against his ribs. With a trembling hand, he clicked the message open. The body of the email was empty, containing nothing but a single attached image file. He downloaded it, and a photograph bloomed on his screen, a photograph that stole the air from his lungs. It was Sarah. He had never seen this picture before. She was standing on the factory floor of Miles Automotive, looking stressed and exhausted, her brow furrowed in concentration as she held a set of complex blueprints. The photo was time-stamped with the date of her death, just 3 hours before the explosion. It was a ghost from a past he thought was buried, irrefutable proof that she had been deeply involved in something troubling right before she died. The M from the sender's address burned in his mind. M for Miles, or M for Marina. The image shattered his passive grief and forged it into cold, sharp-edged resolve. The official investigation had been closed years ago, ruled a tragic but straightforward industrial accident. Now Daniel knew that was a lie. He had to find his own answers. His first instinct was to start with the one tangible piece of evidence he had: the car. As a mechanic, he knew the language of steel and registration numbers better than he knew most people. Using the police report number from the accident, he accessed a vehicle registration database, his fingers tapping quickly on the keyboard. As he expected, the late-model sedan Marina had been driving was registered to a corporate fleet owned by Miles Automotive. It was a concrete link, but not a surprising one. He was about to close the search when he looked closer at the license plate number listed on the report. It was a custom plate, Amigio H438. It wasn't a standard state-issued sequence. A flicker of memory, a fragment from the hundreds of documents he had reviewed nights before, surfaced in his mind. He pulled out an old asset inventory list from the case file, his eyes scanning the columns of alphanumeric codes. And then he found it. MAW H138 was not just a license plate. It was an internal company designation. MAW, Miles Automotive Warehouse, H38, Holding Bay 138, inside a decommissioned facility on the industrial south side of the city. A cold dread washed over him as the pieces began to connect. A woman named Marina Miles, driving a company car with a coded license plate pointing to an abandoned warehouse, crashes in a fiery wreck after he receives a cryptic email signed M. It was too much to be a coincidence. His thoughts turned immediately to Marina, still recovering in the hospital. The image of her frightened, vulnerable face was now tainted with suspicion. What if her amnesia was a convenient lie? What if her terror at the sound of her own company's name was not fear, but guilt? The red herring took root in his mind, a dark and insidious possibility. Perhaps she wasn't a victim in this at all. Perhaps she was an accomplice, an employee of Miles Automotive tasked with destroying evidence that was in that car, and the crash was a botched attempt. He was her savior, but he might also be her accuser. The conflict tore at him. He was a man who fixed things, who believed in helping people, who had run into a burning car without a second thought. But he was also the husband of a woman whose death had been brushed aside, and his need for justice was a primal, burning force. He looked from the picture of his wife on the screen to the address of the warehouse he had just written down on a notepad. The slow, simmering grief of the last 4 years had finally found a direction. It was no longer a passive state of being. It was a mission. He stood up and walked over to a large city map pinned to the wall of his office. He found the address, a forgotten industrial park by the old rail yards, and marked it with a firm, decisive circle. He didn't know what he would find there, but he knew he had to go. He was no longer just a father and a mechanic. He was a hunter, and he was finally on the trail. Dusk was settling over the city, casting long, skeletal shadows from the decaying husks of the industrial district. Daniel parked his truck 3 blocks away. the familiar rumble of its engine sounding unnervingly loud in the profound silence of the forgotten neighborhood. He approached the address on foot, his boots crunching on broken glass and gravel. The warehouse designated MADU H38 loomed before him, a monolithic block of rust-stained corrugated steel and broken windows. Weeds grew thick and wild from cracks in the concrete, nature's slow, deliberate reclamation of a place the world had abandoned. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and decay. This was not just a building, it was a tomb, a place where secrets were sent to die. He felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach, a mixture of fear and grim determination. Every instinct told him to turn back, to go home to his daughter, but the image of Sarah's face in that photograph pushed him forward. He circled the perimeter, his mechanic's eyes scanning for a weakness in the structure's decaying defenses. He found it in a side maintenance door, its lock so corroded that a firm shove with his shoulder was enough to break it open with a groan of tortured metal. He slipped inside, pulling the door shut behind him. The interior was cavernous, a cathedral of dust and darkness. Faint light from the dying day filtered through grimy skylights high above, illuminating thick columns of dust that hung in the still air like captured spirits. The silence was absolute, broken only by the drip of water somewhere in the vast, echoing space, and the sound of his own heart beating a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He moved cautiously through aisles of derelict machinery and pallets of rotting, unidentified cargo, his flashlight beam cutting a nervous path through the gloom. He was an intruder here, a trespasser in the sealed history of Miles Automotive. He found holding bay 138 in the far corner of the building. It was a large, wire-fenced enclosure, secured with a heavy-duty padlock. But the gate was slightly ajar. Someone had been here recently. Stepping inside, he found the bay was mostly empty, save for a few splintered crates and discarded tarps. It felt like a dead end. He was about to turn away in frustration when his flashlight caught a series of faint, parallel scuff marks on the dusty concrete floor, leading to a section of the back wall. It was a detail most would overlook, but to his trained eye, it indicated something heavy being dragged away from the wall repeatedly over time. He ran his hands along the corrugated steel paneling until he felt it. A slight indentation, a hidden seam. Using the edge of a pry bar from his tool belt, he worked the panel loose, revealing a dark, recessed cavity. Inside sat a single fire-resistant metal lockbox. His hands trembled as he lifted the box out and placed it on the floor. It was unlocked. He opened the lid, and his breath caught in his throat. It was filled with documents, binders and folders, all stamped with a stark red logo he had never seen before, a stylized R inside a circle. The top binder was labeled R Lab Project, Final Incident Review. He began to read, and the carefully constructed lies of the past 4 years crumbled into dust. The pages were filled with technical schematics, falsified safety reports, and damning internal memos detailing the company's decision to use a cheaper, unstable alloy in their new engine prototypes to cut costs. He found his wife's personnel file, her clear professional headshot clipped to the corner. The report detailed her role as a lead engineer and her heroic final moments, describing how she had manually engaged an emergency coolant system to prevent a chain reaction that would have destroyed the entire facility. She had died saving dozens of lives, a hero whose story had been buried under a corporate press release about a tragic accident. Then he saw it. Tucked behind his wife's file was another, thinner folder. The subject's name was Marina Miles, listed as a junior research intern. His blood ran cold. As he scanned her profile, a single line of text leaped off the page. For access to secure R-Lab facilities, all project personnel are marked with a non-removable subdermal identifier. He stared at the line, the image of the strange pale scar on Marina's wrist flashing in his mind. The stylized R from the logo on the binder. It wasn't a random mark. It was a key, a brand, an indicator of her direct involvement in the secret project that had killed his wife. He felt a wave of dizziness, the truth more horrifying than he could have imagined. Overwhelmed, he sank back against a support beam, the papers spread around him. In his daze, his fingers found the locket still in his jacket pocket. He pulled it out, the engraving seeming to mock him. He turned it over and over, his thumb tracing its smooth surface, when he felt a tiny, almost imperceptible catch along the hinge. His mechanic's curiosity took over. He worked at it with his fingernail, and a hidden clasp released. The locket didn't open to reveal a space for a photo. It split into two halves, revealing a small, hollowed-out compartment. Nestled inside, protected by a tiny piece of foam, was a minuscule USB flash drive. The locket wasn't a memento. It was a dead drop. It was the evidence. He drove with a singular, desperate focus, the city lights smearing into streaks of neon in his peripheral vision. The world outside his truck ceased to exist. His entire universe had collapsed into the tiny, metallic object resting on the passenger seat. The USB drive. It was a bomb, a key, a ghost. His mind raced, replaying the information from the files in a chaotic, horrifying loop. Our lab, Sarah's last moments, the scar, Marina, every known variable in his life had been thrown into the air, and he had no idea how they would land. The only place he trusted was his garage. He screeched into the driveway, fumbled with his keys, and slammed the heavy bay door shut, sealing himself inside with the secrets he had unearthed. The air was cold, but sweat beaded on his forehead. He sat down at the old, standalone desktop computer in his office, one he kept disconnected from the internet for diagnostics. His hands shook as he plugged the tiny drive into the USB port. A single folder appeared on the screen, locked with a password. A prompt blinked expectantly. What is her first gift? Daniel stared at it, a wave of complete helplessness washing over him. It was a question he could never answer, a lock he could never pick. The truth was inches away, encrypted behind a memory that wasn't his. He slammed his fist on the desk. He didn't have the key, but he knew who did. His suspicion of Marina, the dark theory that she was an accomplice, evaporated in a flash of desperate clarity. He had been looking at it all wrong. She wasn't the villain. She was the only person alive who could help him. He grabbed the locket and the box of files and ran back to his truck. He burst into the hospital with the force of a man possessed, ignoring the startled look from the nurse at the reception desk. He didn't slow his pace until he reached Marina's room. He found her dressed in street clothes, packing a small bag, a doctor signing her discharge papers. "We have to talk," Daniel said, his voice ragged, breathless. The doctor shot him a disapproving look. "Sir, my patient needs rest." Daniel ignored him, his eyes locked on Marina. "The R lab," he said, the words sharp and low. "The scar on your wrist. Tell me what it means." Marina froze, her face draining of all color. Seeing the wild look in his eyes, the doctor reluctantly stepped back. Daniel strode forward and emptied the contents of the lockbox onto her bed. The binder labeled R Lab Project landed with a soft thud. At the sight of it, something inside her broke. A choked gasp escaped her lips. Her hands flew to her mouth, her eyes widening in sheer horror. It wasn't the slow dawning of a returning memory. It was a violent, shattering impact. Fragments of her past returned in a painful, overwhelming flood. The sterile smell of the lab, the low hum of machinery, the cold, menacing face of the man she called father. He told me it was an accident," she whispered, her body trembling. "He told me she was gone." She stumbled back, sinking onto the edge of the bed, her gaze fixed on the files. Daniel, still caught in the grip of his own quest for vengeance, misunderstood her pain as guilt. "Your father," he said, his voice raw with 4 years of repressed fury. Your father killed my wife." Marina looked up at him then, her eyes swimming with a sorrow so profound it stunned him into silence. "He's not my father," she said, her voice cracking. She took a shuddering breath and delivered the words that shattered his world. "Your wife, Sarah, she was my mother." Daniel felt the floor drop out from beneath him. The sounds of the hospital, the distant beeping, the rolling of a cart in the hall, faded into a dull roar. He could only stare at her, at this young woman he had pulled from a burning car, his mind refusing to process her words. What did you say?" he managed to stammer. The story then came tumbling out of her, disjointed and raw. Sarah had given her up for adoption as a teenager, a heartbreaking decision made out of love. They had only found each other again a year ago, meeting in secret, trying to piece together a relationship that had been stolen from them. The man who had adopted her was Richard Miles, the ruthless CEO of Miles Automotive. When Sarah, now his employee, discovered the deadly flaw in the R-Lab project and threatened to expose him, Miles had used Marina, his own adopted daughter, as leverage to ensure Sarah's silence. "After the explosion," Marina continued, tears streaming down her face, "he couldn't risk letting me go. I knew too much. He became my legal guardian, my jailer. He forced me to work at the company, kept me on a leash. The car crash, that wasn't an accident. I found these files, and this." She pointed to the locket in Daniel's hand. "I was trying to get away. I was trying to get to the authorities when his men ran me off the road." Daniel looked down at the silver locket, as if seeing it for the first time. "M.M., he whispered. "Marina Miles." She shook her head, a sad, bitter smile touching her lips. "He gave me that name. He wanted to erase every trace of her. But when my mother gave that locket to me, she told me what it really stood for. My birth name. The name she gave me. Mary. It stands for Mary." The power in the room shifted, the air crackling with the impossible, undeniable truth. The chasm of suspicion and anger that had separated them vanished, replaced by a bridge of shared loss and a common bloodline. This wasn't the daughter of his enemy. This was his daughter. Sarah's daughter. A living, breathing piece of the woman he had lost. His mission of vengeance was suddenly transformed into a mission of protection. He looked at Mary, not Marina, but Mary, and saw not a stranger, but family. He took a hesitant step forward and reached out, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. The contact was electric, a silent acknowledgement that their lives, thrown apart by tragedy, had been violently, miraculously slammed back together by fate. They were no longer two separate people caught in a conspiracy. They were a father and a daughter, and their fight for justice had just begun. There was no time for the quiet, contemplative reunion of a father and daughter. Their new reality was forged in urgency, born directly into the heart of a 4-year-old war. Daniel took Mary from the hospital, not to the warmth of a welcoming home, but to the cold, strategic safety of his garage. It was the one place he knew was secure, a fortress of steel and concrete where they could think, plan, and, most importantly, act. The emotional weight of their reunion was a powerful undercurrent, but on the surface, they moved with a shared, unspoken focus. The grief would come later. First, there was justice. They stood before the old computer in his office, the blinking password prompt a final barrier between them and the truth. What is her first gift? Daniel looked at Mary, whose eyes had grown distant, lost in a memory that was finally hers again. A sad, gentle smile touched her lips. "When she found me," Mary said, her voice soft with the memory, "we met at a small cafe. She was so nervous. She said she didn't know how to be a mother after so much time, but she brought me a gift." She paused, her gaze fixed on the screen. It was a small, leather-bound journal. She told me the past had been written by other people, but this was for me, so I could write my own story. Daniel felt a lump form in his throat. He watched as Mary leaned forward, her fingers hovering over the keyboard before typing, one letter at a time. My own story. She pressed enter. With a soft click, the drive unlocked. The contents were more damning than Daniel could have ever imagined. It wasn't just files. It was Richard Miles's entire conspiracy, laid bare. They found the unredacted engineering reports, with Sarah's name listed as the lead inventor on every key patent. They found financial records detailing the payoffs to safety inspectors. They found a chain of executive emails in which Miles himself explicitly ordered the use of the faulty alloy, callously weighing human life against profit margins. And they found the final devastating piece of evidence. It was an audio file, labeled simply with a date, the day before the explosion. Daniel clicked play, and the speakers filled with the clear, courageous voice of his wife. It was a recording of her last conversation with Richard Miles. They heard Sarah confronting him, threatening to go to the board and the press. And they heard Miles's voice, cold and reptilian, responding with a threat of his own, making it clear that if she spoke, the life of his beloved adopted daughter would be irrevocably ruined. It was the smoking gun, irrefutable proof of motive, theft, and blackmail. Mary buried her face in her hands, sobbing quietly as her mother's last, defiant words echoed in the small office. Daniel wrapped an arm around her, his own grief a silent, burning rage. They now held the weapon that could destroy Richard Miles. The only question was how to fire it. Going to the police felt too risky. Miles was a man of immense power and influence. He would have allies in every corner of the city. They needed a stage he couldn't control, a spotlight he couldn't escape. A quick search on Daniel's phone gave them their answer. In less than 24 hours. Miles Automotive was set to host a major international press conference to unveil their revolutionary new engine, the very same technology Sarah had died to protect. The arrogance of it was breathtaking. Richard Miles was planning to build his legacy on top of Sarah's grave. It was there, in the full glare of the public eye, that they would tear it all down. They spent the next few hours meticulously packaging the evidence, the audio file, the most damning emails, the proof of stolen patents, and sent the encrypted file to a single, trusted investigative journalist known for her tenacity and refusal to back down from powerful figures. The instructions were simple. Do not open until 10 minutes after the Miles Automotive press conference begins. The next day, the grand ballroom of the city's most luxurious hotel was filled to capacity. Cameras flashed, and journalists from around the world mingled, sipping champagne, ready to witness the triumph of a corporate titan. On stage, under a massive banner that read, "The Future of Power," Richard Miles stood at the podium, a portrait of success and untouchable confidence. He smiled for the cameras, a predator basking in the warmth of the spotlight. As he began to speak, lauding his company's unwavering commitment to innovation, a change began to ripple through the room. Phones buzzed. A low murmur spread among the journalists as they received and quickly decrypted the file. A freelance reporter near the front, either by accident or design, fumbled with his phone, and for a split second, a fragment of the audio file played aloud into the silent ballroom. Sarah's voice, clear and strong, followed by Miles's cold, threatening response. The room fell silent. Miles faltered at the podium, his confident smile tightening into a mask of confusion and panic. It was then that the journalist they had contacted, a woman named Clara Jensen, stood up. "Mr. Miles," she called out, her voice cutting through the tension like a razor. "Clara Jensen, Global Press. Can you comment on evidence that suggests the technology for this engine was stolen from your former lead engineer, Sarah Matthews, and that your company deliberately covered up the true circumstances of her death 4 years ago?" The question hit the room like a grenade. Chaos erupted. Shouts and questions flew from every direction. Miles, His face pale and slick with sweat, stammered denials, calling for security to remove the journalist. But it was too late. The dam had broken. The truth was flooding the room, the internet, the world. At that precise moment, the grand doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. Two homicide detectives, flanked by uniformed officers, walked down the center aisle with grim, unhurried purpose. They walked past the frantic press, past the stunned executives, and straight up the steps to the stage. One of the detectives leaned into the microphone, his voice calm and clear. "Richard Miles," he said, the words echoing through the now silent hall. "You are under arrest for the murder of Sarah Matthews." The flashbulbs erupted in a blinding, continuous strobe as the detectives cuffed his hands behind his back, his empire of lies and greed crumbling to dust in the very spotlight he had so desperately craved. 1 year later, the autumn sun cast a warm, golden light across the open bay doors of Daniel's garage. The scent of motor oil and freshly brewed coffee hung in the air, a familiar and comforting perfume. He had reopened the shop, not out of necessity, but out of love for the work. The rhythmic clatter of his tools and the low hum of a finely tuned engine were the sounds of his life returning to a peaceful, steady rhythm. The sensational headlines had faded. The lengthy court battles had concluded with Richard Miles sentenced to life in prison, and the world had moved on. But for Daniel and Mary, life hadn't just moved on. It had begun anew. They had navigated the complexities of their new reality with a quiet grace, building a family from the ashes of a tragedy. Mary had become a fixed point in his and Lily's lives, her laughter now as much a part of the house as the scent of Sarah's old rose bushes in the garden. That afternoon, Daniel stood in his small office, a hammer in one hand and a nail in the other. He was hanging a new picture on the wall. It was a simple dark wood frame, and inside were 3 faces. One was a recent photograph of him and Mary, taken at a park last summer, both of them smiling, their shared features a subtle but undeniable echo of the woman who connected them. Beside it, he had carefully mounted his favorite picture of Sarah, her eyes bright with the fierce intelligence and warmth he had fallen in love with. It was the family that should have been, finally brought together in a single frame. It was a statement of acceptance, a quiet acknowledgement that the past and present could finally coexist in peace. As he stepped back to admire his work, Mary walked in, carrying a box of files. "The paperwork for the foundation is ready to be filed," she said, her voice filled with a calm sense of purpose. Using a portion of the substantial settlement from the lawsuit, they had created a charity to support the families of firefighters and other first responders. It was their way of honoring both Sarah's final heroic act and Daniel's selfless one. Later that evening, the house was quiet. Lily was asleep, and Mary had gone to her own apartment in the city. Daniel sat in his worn leather armchair, the soft glow of a table lamp illuminating the living room. His eyes fell upon the small, silver locket resting on the mantelpiece. It was no longer a piece of evidence, a clue in a dark conspiracy, but a sacred family heirloom. He picked it up, its weight familiar in his palm. He had once thought he knew all its secrets, the hidden USB drive, the true meaning of its initials. But Mary had shown him its final, most important one. He pressed a tiny, almost invisible catch on the locket's filigreed edge. The back of the locket, a compartment entirely separate from the one that had held the drive, swung open on a delicate hinge. Inside, protected beneath a tiny circle of glass, was a minuscule photograph of a young, smiling Sarah. It was a picture from before he had even known her, full of a hope that broke his heart and mended it at the same time. Tucked carefully behind the photo was a tiny folded square of paper, as thin as a butterfly's wing. With the gentle precision of a mechanic handling a delicate instrument, he carefully extracted it and unfolded it. On the paper, in Sarah's familiar, elegant script, was a short message, a mother's last prayer for the daughter she had been forced to leave behind. It read, "If someone saves you, it means fate still believes in good." Daniel read the words again, a profound sense of wonder washing over him. The circular nature of it all, the impossible, beautiful symmetry of fate. He looked from the note in his hand to the new family photo on the office wall. His single instinctive act of running toward a burning car a year ago was not random. It was the answer to a prayer he never knew had been uttered. He had been the good that fate had sent for Sarah's daughter, and in saving her, he had unknowingly saved himself, piecing together his own broken heart and bringing his family home.